The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 15 years. Margaret rolled over and hit the snooze button, her joints aching from another restless night. At 62, her body wasn't what it used to be, but she still pushed herself to get up and face another day of work. The night shift at the downtown office complex wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept her busy. She shuffled to the kitchen and made herself a cup of instant coffee, the same brand she'd been drinking since her husband passed away. The house felt too quiet in the early morning hours. Her son David was still asleep upstairs with his girlfriend Jessica, probably dreaming about their future together. Margaret smiled, thinking about how different their lives were. While they slept peacefully, she prepared for another night of cleaning offices and emptying trash cans. The drive to work was peaceful at this hour. Traffic was light, and she could think clearly without all the noise and chaos of the day. She thought about her late husband Wei and how proud he would be of her for staying strong all these years. He had always told her she was tougher than. She looked, and she proved him right every single day. When Margaret arrived at the office building, she noticed something different. Her supervisor, Mr. Johnson, was waiting for her in the lobby. This was unusual because he rarely showed up during the night shift. He looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other, avoiding eye contact. Margaret's stomach dropped. She had worked long enough to know when something was wrong. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said quietly, gesturing toward the small office near the entrance. Her heart started beating faster as she followed him. The office smelled like stale coffee and copy machine toner. Mr. Johnson sat behind the desk and pulled out a manila envelope. "I'm really sorry about this, Margaret. You've been a good employee, one of our best, actually. But the company is making budget cuts, and we have to let some people go." He slid the envelope across the desk. "This is your termination notice and final paycheck. Your last day is today." Margaret stared at the envelope without touching it. 15 years of getting up before dawn, 15 years of scrubbing toilets and vacuuming carpets, 15 years of being reliable and hardworking, and it all ended with a piece of paper in a manila envelope. She felt numb, like she was watching this happen to someone else. "I know this is hard," Mr. Johnson continued, "but you'll be eligible for unemployment benefits, and we're giving you 2 weeks severance pay." "That's more than we're required to." "Give 2 weeks pay." Margaret almost laughed. 2 weeks to figure out how to survive without a job at 62 years old. Who was going to hire her? She had no college degree, no special skills that looked good on paper. All she had was experience cleaning offices, and apparently that wasn't enough anymore. She finally reached for the envelope and stood up slowly. "Thank you for letting me know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Johnson looked relieved that she wasn't making a scene. He probably expected her to cry or argue, but Margaret had learned long ago that crying didn't solve problems. The drive home felt longer than usual. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. On any other day, she would have appreciated the beauty of the sunrise. Today, it just reminded her that she was driving home without a job, without a plan, without any idea what came next. David's car was still in the driveway when she pulled up. She sat in her car for a few minutes, trying to gather the courage to go inside and face her new reality. Through the kitchen window, she could see him moving around, probably making breakfast for himself and Jessica. They looked so young and carefree, so different from how she felt right now. When she finally walked through the front door, David was standing at the stove making eggs. Jessica was sitting at the table scrolling through her phone. They both looked up when she entered. "Mom, you're home early," David said, not looking away from the pan. "Everything okay?" Margaret set her purse on the counter and took a deep breath. "I lost my job today. Budget cuts." David stopped stirring the eggs and turned to look at her. Jessica put down her phone. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet except for the sizzling sound from the stove. "Oh, Mom, I'm sorry," David said, but his voice sounded distant, like he was already thinking about something else. "That's rough. But maybe this is a good thing, you know? You've been working nights for so long." Maybe it's time to slow down? Slow down? Margaret wanted to laugh. How could she slow down when she had bills to pay and a life to maintain? David made it sound like losing her job was some kind of gift, like she should be grateful for the opportunity to sit around the house all day. I need to find another job, she said simply. Jessica looked up from her phone. At your age? I mean, no offense, but isn't it hard to find work when you're older? Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest. She had raised David to be kinder than this, to think before he spoke, but Jessica was right and they all knew it. Finding work at 62 was going to be nearly impossible, especially without a college degree or modern job skills. I'll figure something out, Margaret said, walking toward the stairs. I always do. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, the same room she had shared with Wei all those years ago. The same room where she had cried herself to sleep after he died, where she had made countless plans for David's future, where she had dreamed about the day when life would get easier. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and opened the manila envelope. The termination letter was formal and cold, full of corporate language about restructuring and cost-cutting measures. Her final paycheck was smaller than she expected after taxes and deductions. 2 weeks of severance pay wouldn't last long, and unemployment benefits would be even less. She looked around her bedroom at the faded wallpaper and worn furniture. Everything in this room held memories of a different life, a time when she felt secure and hopeful. Now she felt like she was drowning, gasping for air in a world that had no place for someone like her. On her nightstand sat a framed photo of Wei, taken about 30 years ago when they still owned their small grocery store. He was smiling, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking so young and optimistic. They had no idea what the future held, no idea about the struggles that were coming. Margaret picked up the photo and traced Wei's face with her finger. He had been the dreamer in their relationship, always talking about investments and business opportunities. She had been the practical one, focused on daily survival and raising David, but Wei had taught her things, shown her how to think beyond just getting by. If only David knew the whole story. If only he understood what his father had really left behind, what his mother had spent decades building and protecting. But those were secrets she had kept hidden, waiting for the right time to share them. Looking at her current situation, she wondered if that time would ever come. Downstairs, she could hear David and Jessica talking in low voices, probably discussing her situation. She couldn't make out the words, but she could guess what they were saying. The old woman upstairs had become a problem, a burden they hadn't planned for. Margaret lay back on her bed and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would start looking for work. She would swallow her pride and apply for jobs that paid minimum wage. She would pretend to be grateful for any opportunity, no matter how small. But tonight she would allow herself to feel the weight of this moment, the fear and uncertainty that came with losing everything she thought she could count on. Outside her window, the world was waking up. People were starting their day, going to jobs they still had, living lives that felt secure and predictable. Margaret had been one of those people just a few hours ago. Now she was something else entirely, someone starting over when she thought her life was already figured out. 3 months had passed since Margaret lost her job, and the house felt different now. The morning routine she had followed for 15 years was gone, replaced by long, empty days filled with job applications and rejection letters. She tried to stay busy cleaning the house from top to bottom, cooking elaborate meals that David and Jessica barely touched, and watching the same daytime television shows over and over. The unemployment checks helped, but they weren't enough to cover all her expenses. She had started cutting back on everything, buying generic brands at the grocery store, turning off lights religiously and wearing sweaters instead of turning up the heat. Every penny counted now, and she felt the weight of financial stress settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. David had been patient at first. He would ask about her job search over dinner, offer to help with her resume, and even drove her to a few interviews. But as the weeks turned into months, she could see the frustration building in his eyes. The conversations became shorter, the offers of help less frequent, and the atmosphere in the house grew tense. Jessica was less subtle about her feelings. She would sigh loudly when Margaret was in the kitchen during the day, make comments about privacy and space, and spend most of her time upstairs in David's room. Margaret could hear them talking late at night, their voices low but urgent, and she knew she was the topic of their conversations. One Tuesday morning, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, circling job listings that she knew she probably wouldn't qualify for. The classifieds were full of positions requiring computer skills, college degrees, or experience she didn't have. She had already applied to every cleaning company in the city, visited every retail store within driving distance, and even inquired about part-time work at fast food restaurants. The problem was her age. Nobody said it directly, but she could see it in their eyes when she walked into interviews. They would look at her gray hair, notice the slight tremor in her hands from arthritis, and immediately start talking about the physical demands of the job or the need for someone with more energy. It was discrimination, but proving it was another matter entirely. David came downstairs around noon, still in his pajamas and looking tired. He worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant his schedule was flexible, but his income was unpredictable. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Margaret at the table. "Any luck today?" he asked, nodding toward the newspaper. Margaret shook her head. "I called about 3 positions this morning. 2 of them said they'd already filled the spots, and the third one wanted someone with experience in commercial cleaning, equipment that I don't have." David rubbed his forehead and sighed. "Mom, I've been thinking, maybe you're being too picky." "There are other options out there." "Like what?" Margaret asked, though she could tell from his tone that she wasn't going to like his answer. "Well, there are programs for seniors. Social services, assisted living facilities, places that specifically help people in your situation." He wasn't looking at her directly, instead staring at his coffee cup. "I did some research online, and there are actually some nice places that offer affordable housing for older adults." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "You want me to move into a retirement home?" "Not a retirement home," David said quickly. "More like independent living. You'd have your own apartment, but there would be services available if you need them. Meals, transportation, activities with other people your age, other people her age." Margaret was 62, not 92. She was still capable of taking care of herself, still looking for work, still hoping to rebuild her life. The idea of being warehoused with other seniors felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. "I'm not ready for that," she said firmly. "I just need more time to find the right job. Mom, it's been 3 months. David's voice was getting sharper now. "You've applied everywhere. Maybe it's time to face reality." Before Margaret could respond, Jessica appeared in the doorway. She was dressed for work, her hair perfectly styled and her makeup flawless. She looked young and confident, everything Margaret used to be and no longer felt. "Oh, good, you're having the conversation," Jessica said, walking over to stand behind David's chair. "I was hoping you'd bring this up today." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "You two have been discussing my future behind my back?" "We're just worried about you," Jessica said, but her tone didn't sound worried. It sounded impatient. "And honestly, this situation is affecting all of us. David's been stressed about money, and I feel like I can't relax in my own home." "Your own home." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. This was her home, the place she had lived for over 20 years, the place where she had raised David and mourned Way. But legally, Jessica was right. Margaret had signed the house over to David a few years ago as part of estate planning, thinking it would save on taxes and ensure he had security. She had never imagined she would be the one without security. "I understand this is difficult," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I'm doing my best to find work. I just need a little more time." "How much more time?" Jessica asked. "Another month? 6 months? A year? We're trying to start our own family, and we need space and privacy. This house isn't big enough for all of us long term." Margaret looked at David, hoping he would defend her or at least soften Jessica's harsh words. But he just sat there, staring at his coffee, looking uncomfortable, but not disagreeing. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Margaret asked. David finally looked up. "We think it would be best if you found somewhere else to live, somewhere more suitable for your situation." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Margaret felt dizzy, like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Her son, the child she had raised alone after his father died, the boy she had worked double shifts to support through college, was asking her to leave. "I see," she said quietly. "And when would you like me to be gone?" "We're not throwing you out on the street," David said quickly. "We'll help you find a place, maybe one of those senior apartments I mentioned. They have waiting lists, but we can get you on them right away." "How long do I have?" Margaret asked again. David and Jessica exchanged a look. "Maybe by the end of the month?" Jessica suggested. "That gives you about 3 weeks to figure things out." 3 weeks. Margaret had lived in this house for over 2 decades, and now she had 3 weeks to pack up her life and find somewhere else to go. She thought about all the memories in these walls. All the late nights she had spent worrying about David's future, all the sacrifices she had made to ensure he had opportunities she never had. "I understand," she said, standing up from the table. "I'll start looking for a place right away." She walked upstairs to her bedroom, her legs feeling shaky and weak. Behind her, she could hear David and Jessica talking in low voices, probably relieved that she hadn't fought or cried or made a scene. She had always been good at keeping her emotions under control, at handling whatever life threw at her with dignity and grace. In her bedroom, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and looked around at her belongings. How do you pack up 20 years of life in 3 weeks? How do you decide what's important enough to keep when you're moving to a place you can't even afford yet? She opened her dresser drawer and pulled out a small address book, its pages yellow with age. Inside were phone numbers for senior housing facilities, social services, and other resources she had hoped she'd never need. She had been collecting these numbers for weeks, just in case, but she never thought she'd actually have to use them. The phone calls were humbling. Most of the decent places had waiting lists that stretched for months or even years. The ones with immediate availability were either too expensive or located in neighborhoods that didn't feel safe. Margaret found herself explaining her situation over and over, her voice getting smaller each time. By the end of the day, she had made dozens of calls and filled out several applications. The best option seemed to be a subsidized apartment complex about 30 minutes away, but even that had a waiting list. The caseworker she spoke with was kind but realistic. "At your age and with your income situation, you qualify for emergency housing assistance," the woman explained. "It's not ideal, but it's temporary shelter while you wait for something permanent to open up. Emergency housing." Margaret had never imagined those words would apply to her life. She had always been the one who had things figured out, who planned ahead and saved for emergencies. But she had never planned for this particular emergency, losing her job and her home at the same time. That evening, David tried to make conversation. Over dinner, asking about her calls and offering to help with applications. But the damage was done. The message was clear. She was no longer welcome in the home she had helped create. By the son she had devoted her life to raising. After dinner, Margaret went to her room and pulled out a small metal box from the back of her closet. Inside were important documents, her birth certificate, Way's death certificate, insurance papers, and a small key she had kept hidden for years. She held the key in her palm, feeling its weight, remembering what it opened and what it represented. The smell hit Margaret first, a mixture of industrial disinfectant, old coffee, and something else she couldn't identify. It was the smell of desperation, of lives that had taken unexpected turns. She stood in the doorway of the women's shelter, clutching her single suitcase with both hands, trying to process that this was actually happening to her. 3 weeks had passed since David and Jessica delivered their ultimatum, and despite all her calls and applications, Margaret hadn't found anywhere else to go. The waiting lists for affordable senior housing stretched on for months, and the few places that had immediate openings required deposits she couldn't afford. The emergency housing caseworker had been apologetic, but direct, the shelter was her. "Only option right now, first time?" asked a woman behind the front desk. She was probably in her 40s, with tired eyes but a kind smile. Her name tag read, Linda, Volunteer Coordinator. She had the look of someone who had seen it all and still chose to help. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She had practiced this moment in her head, imagining how she would maintain her dignity, how she would be gracious and grateful. But standing here now, with her entire life reduced to one suitcase, she felt smaller than she ever had before. "It's going to be okay," Linda said gently. "I know this feels overwhelming, but you're safe here. Let me show you around and get you settled in." The tour was brief but thorough. The shelter could house up to 40 women with shared bedrooms, communal bathrooms, and a large common area with donated furniture and a small television. There was a kitchen where residents could prepare simple meals, a laundry room with 2 washing machines, and a small office where social workers met with residents to discuss their situations. "Lights out is at 10 p.m., Linda explained as they walked. "Breakfast is served from 6 to 8, and you can store some personal items in the common refrigerator. But make sure to label everything with your name. We ask that everyone help with chores, cleaning, cooking, that sort of thing. It helps keep the place running and gives people something to do." Margaret was assigned to bed number 12 in a room with 5 other women. The beds were basic metal frames with thin mattresses separated by small knitstands that had seen better days. Each woman had a small locker for personal belongings, and there was one shared dresser that nobody seemed to use. Her bunk was the bottom one, which Linda explained was easier for older residents. The woman in the top bunk was named Rosa, probably in her 30s, with calloused hands and paint under her fingernails. She was reading a paperback romance novel when Margaret arrived. "Welcome to paradise," Rosa said with a dry laugh. "Been here long?" Margaret asked, setting her suitcase on the thin mattress. 3 months, Rosa replied. "Lost my job at the auto shop, then couldn't make rent. Landlord gave me 2 weeks to get out. Same old story, really. You?" Margaret wasn't sure how to answer that. How do you explain that your own son asked you to leave? How do you admit that at 62 you had nowhere else to go? "Job loss," she said simply. "Couldn't afford to stay where I was." Rosa nodded knowingly. "Yeah, happens to the best of us. The economy's rough right now, especially for us older folks. I'm 41, and they act like I'm ready for the grave." Over the next few days, Margaret learned everyone's story. There was Patricia, a woman in her 50s who had been caring for her elderly mother until the medical bills bankrupted them both. Carmen was barely 25, fleeing an abusive relationship with her 2-year-old daughter. Betty was 78 and had been evicted when her fixed income couldn't keep up with rising rent. Each woman had a different story, but they all shared the same look in their eyes, the mixture of fear and determination that comes from losing everything and having to start over. Margaret recognized that look because she saw it in the mirror every morning. The days at the shelter followed a routine. Wake up at 6, eat breakfast if you could stomach the watery oatmeal or stale cereal, then spend the day looking for work or dealing with social services. Margaret would walk the streets with a folder full of resumes, visiting every business that might possibly hire someone her age. The reactions were always the same. Store managers would look at her gray hair and slightly stooped shoulders, then politely explain that they needed someone with more energy, or that the position required heavy lifting, or that they were looking for someone with more recent experience. Nobody wanted to hire a 62-year-old woman who had been unemployed for months. At the fast food restaurants, teenage managers would take her application with barely concealed amusement. At the retail stores, she was told she was overqualified. At the grocery stores, they explained that their insurance wouldn't cover someone with her health issues, though she had never mentioned having any health problems. The worst rejection came from a small cleaning company that advertised for experienced cleaners. Margaret thought this would be perfect. She had 15 years of experience and knew how to work hard. But when she showed up for the interview, the owner took one look at her and shook his head. "Look, lady, I'm sure you're a nice person, but this job requires someone who can move fast and work long hours. You look like you should be thinking about retirement, not starting a new career." Margaret left that interview feeling more defeated than ever. If she couldn't even get hired to do the same work she had been doing for 15 years, what hope did she have? The evenings at the shelter were the hardest part. After a full day of rejection and humiliation, she would return to the crowded room with its thin walls and constant noise. Some women would be crying quietly into their pillows. Others would be on their phones, trying to find family members who might take them in. A few would be in the common area, watching television or playing cards, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. Margaret usually sat on her bunk, writing in a small notebook she had bought at the dollar store. She kept track of her job applications, her expenses, and her thoughts. Writing helped her process the enormous changes in her life, and it gave her something to do with her hands when the anxiety became overwhelming. One evening, about 2 weeks into her stay, Margaret was sitting in the common area when Carmen's little girl approached her. The child was shy and hadn't spoken much since arriving at the shelter, but something about Margaret seemed to comfort her. "Are you a grandma?" the little girl asked, crawling up onto the couch next to Margaret. The question hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. She had always imagined being a grandmother someday, pictured herself spoiling David's children the way her own mother had spoiled him. But David and Jessica were focused on their careers and their own space, and now Margaret wasn't even part of their lives. "I don't have any grandchildren," Margaret said softly, "but I'd like to be a grandma someday." The little girl snuggled closer. "My grandma used to read me stories." "Do you know any stories?" Margaret spent the next hour telling the child stories she remembered from David's childhood, fairy tales and adventures that seemed to belong to a different lifetime. The little girl listened with wide eyes, occasionally asking questions or adding her own details to the stories. When Carmen came to collect her daughter for bedtime, she smiled at Margaret. "Thank you for spending time with her. She's been having trouble sleeping since we got here." "She's a wonderful child," Margaret said. "You're doing a great job with her." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "I hope so. This isn't the life I wanted for her, but it's better than where we were." That night, Margaret lay in her bunk thinking about the little girl's question. "Are you a grandma?" The simple question had opened up a well of sadness she had been trying to ignore. She thought about David, probably sleeping peacefully in his comfortable bed, not wondering where his mother was sleeping or whether she was safe. She thought about the house she had signed over to him, the house where she had raised him and loved him and sacrificed for him. She thought about all the times she had put his needs ahead of her own, all the dreams she had postponed to make sure he had opportunities. Most of all, she thought about Wei and what he would think of this situation. He had always been the one who planned for the future, who thought about investments and security. He had taught her to be practical, to think ahead, to prepare for emergencies. But even Wei hadn't prepared her for this particular emergency, being abandoned by the child. She had devoted her life to raising. Margaret reached under her pillow and pulled out the small metal key she had hidden there. In the darkness of the shelter, she held it tightly in her palm, feeling its familiar weight. Tomorrow, she would have to make a decision about what this key represented and whether she was finally ready to use what it could unlock around her. The other women were settling into sleep, their quiet breathing mixing with the occasional sob or whispered prayer. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine a different future, one where she didn't have to depend on anyone else's kindness or charity. The key in her hand felt warm now, like a small piece of hope in the darkness of her current situation. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, Margaret fell asleep with a plan forming in her mind. Margaret woke up before dawn, just like she had every morning for the past month at the shelter, but today was different. Today she was finally going to face the truth she had been avoiding for too long. The small metal key felt cold in her palm as she lay in the darkness, listening to the quiet breathing of the other women around her. She had barely slept, her mind racing with memories of Wei and the promises they had made to each other. He had always been the dreamer, the one who saw possibilities where she saw only problems. Even when they were struggling to keep their small grocery store afloat, he would talk about the future, about building something that would last beyond their lifetimes. "Margaret, you have to think bigger," he would say, counting the day's earnings at their kitchen table. "We can't just think about today or tomorrow. We have to think about David's future, about what we're leaving behind." She had thought he was being unrealistic back then. They were immigrants working 16-hour days just to pay rent and keep food on the table. How could they think about anything beyond survival? But Wei had been patient with her, teaching her slowly about investments and savings, about the importance of planning for the unexpected. Margaret quietly got dressed and slipped out of the shelter before anyone else woke up. The morning air was crisp, and the city streets were nearly empty except for a few early commuters and delivery trucks. She walked the 12 blocks to the bank, her heart pounding with each step. The First National Bank building looked exactly the same as it had when she first opened her account there 25 years ago. The same marble floors, the same high ceilings, the same feeling of important business being conducted behind heavy wooden doors. But Margaret felt completely different walking through those doors now than she had all those years ago. She approached the information desk, where a young woman in a navy blue suit was organizing papers for the day ahead. The woman looked up with a professional smile that faltered slightly when she saw Margaret's worn clothes and tired face. "I need to access my safety deposit box," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman's expression became more polite but distant. "Of course. Do you have your key and identification?" Margaret fumbled in her purse for her driver's license and the small metal key. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she hoped the woman wouldn't notice. After a few moments, the woman typed something into her computer and frowned. "I'm sorry, but I don't see any safety deposit box registered under your name. Are you sure you have the account at this branch?" Margaret's heart sank. Had she remembered wrong? Had something happened to the account? She took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. "Could you check under my maiden name?" "Margaret Chun, but before that, Margaret Kim?" The woman typed again, and this time her expression changed. "Oh, here it is. Margaret Kim, I see you haven't accessed this box in quite some time. Let me get someone to help you." A few minutes later, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared. She was probably in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been working at the bank for decades, and Margaret remembered her from the early days when she would come in to make deposits from the grocery store. "Mrs. Kim," Mrs. Rodriguez said with genuine warmth, "I haven't seen you in months." "How are you?" Margaret wasn't sure how to answer that question. How do you explain that you're living in a homeless shelter to someone who last saw you as a stable, working member of the community? "I'm okay," she said simply. "I need to access my safety deposit box today." Mrs. Rodriguez studied Margaret's face carefully. She had worked in banking long enough to recognize when someone was going through a difficult time, and she could see the stress and exhaustion in Margaret's eyes. "Of course," she said gently. "Let me take you downstairs." The walk to the vault felt like a journey through time. Margaret remembered the first time Wei had brought her here. How nervous she had been about putting their hard-earned money anywhere other than under their mattress. He had convinced her that banks were safe, that their money would grow if they were smart about it. The safety deposit box was smaller than she remembered, but it felt heavier when Mrs. Rodriguez pulled it from the wall. They moved to a private viewing room where Margaret sat alone with the box and her key. For a moment she hesitated. Opening this box would change everything. There would be no going back to the simple story of being a poor old woman with nowhere to go. She would have to face the truth about what she had built and what she had been hiding. With trembling fingers, Margaret turned the key and lifted the lid. Inside were neat stacks of papers, each one carefully labeled in Wei's precise handwriting. Stock certificates, bond documents, property deeds, and bank statements. Margaret had continued his system after he died, adding to the collection year after year. Following the investment strategies he had taught her, she picked up the first document, a stock certificate for a technology company that had been worth almost nothing when Wei bought it 30 years ago. The company had grown and split several times since then, and Margaret had reinvested the dividends just as Wei had taught her. The next document was a property deed for a small apartment building across town. Margaret had bought it 15 years ago with money from the sale of the grocery store, and she had been quietly collecting rent checks ever since. The property had increased in value significantly over the years. Then came the bank statements. Account after account, all in her maiden name, all carefully managed and grown over the decades. Margaret had been disciplined about saving, putting away money from her cleaning job, her rental income, and her investment dividends. She had lived simply, spending only what she needed and investing the rest. As she went through each document, Margaret began to understand the full picture of what she had accumulated. The technology stocks had multiplied in value beyond anything she had imagined. The real estate investments had appreciated steadily. The savings accounts had grown through compound interest and careful management. She pulled out a small calculator from her purse and began adding up the numbers. Her hands were shaking as she worked, double-checking each calculation. The total seemed impossible, too large to be real. $2,300,000. Margaret stared at the number on the calculator, then recalculated it to make sure she hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't. Over the course of 30 years, through careful saving and smart investing, she had accumulated a fortune that would have seemed impossible when she was scrubbing floors for minimum wage. She thought about David, probably waking up in his comfortable bed, worrying about his latest project deadline or whether he could afford the vacation he and Jessica had been planning. He had no idea that his mother, the woman he had asked to leave his house, was worth more than he would probably earn in his entire lifetime. Margaret carefully put the documents back in the box, her mind racing. She had kept this secret for so long, waiting for the right moment to tell David about his inheritance. She had wanted him to be mature enough to handle such wealth responsibly, to understand the value of money and hard work before he learned about the fortune that would eventually be his dote. But now, sitting in this small room with the evidence of her success spread out before her, Margaret realized that moment might never come. David had shown her who he really was when he asked her to leave. He had chosen his comfort over her security, his convenience over her dignity. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. She could walk back to the shelter and continue pretending to be helpless, waiting for David to feel guilty enough to help her. She could reveal the truth and watch his face change from pity to embarrassment to greed. Or she could choose a third option. She could finally start living for herself. Margaret thought about the little girl at the shelter, the one who had asked if she was a grandma. She thought about Rosa, who had been looking for work for months, with no success. She thought about Carmen, trying to build a new life for herself and her daughter. She thought about all the women at the shelter who had been knocked down by life but were still fighting to get back up. Then she thought about herself, about all the dreams she had postponed, all the chances she had never taken, all the things she had wanted to do but had put off for tomorrow. She was 62 years old, and tomorrow had finally arrived. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked gently on the door. "Is everything all right in there, Mrs. Kim?" Margaret looked up, and for the first time in months, she smiled a real smile. "Yes," she said, closing the safety deposit box. "Everything is perfect." As she walked back upstairs to the main floor of the bank, Margaret felt different. The weight of her secret was still there, but now it felt like possibility instead of burden. She had choices now, real choices, and for the first time since she had lost her job, she felt like she was in control of her own life. The young woman at the information desk looked up as Margaret approached. "Did you find everything you needed?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. "I found exactly what I was looking for." Outside the bank, Margaret stood on the sidewalk and looked around at the city waking up around her. People were hurrying to work, starting their daily routines, living their predictable lives. She had been one of those people just a few hours ago, trapped in a cycle of desperation and dependence. Margaret stood outside the house that used to be her home, holding a cashier's check for $50,000 in her trembling hand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn she had once tended with such care, and she could see that the flower beds were already starting to look neglected. David had never been good with plants, and Jessica clearly had no interest in gardening. Through the kitchen window, she could see David pacing back and forth while talking on the phone. His voice was raised, and even from outside she could hear the stress and frustration in his tone. Jessica was sitting at the table with her laptop open, papers scattered around her. Looking just as tense as David sounded, Margaret knew she was probably looking at another one of David's business crises. Throughout his adult life, he had jumped from one venture to another, always convinced that the next idea would be the one that made him rich. When his graphic design business was slow, he had tried day trading. When that failed, he had invested in a friend's restaurant that closed within 6 months. Then there was the online store that never took off, the cryptocurrency investment that lost half its value, and the most recent disaster, a mobile app that had cost him thousands to develop, but had only been downloaded 37 times. Each time David failed, Margaret had been there to help. She had given him money for his business loans, co-signed for his credit cards, and even taken out a second mortgage on the house to fund one of his ventures. She had told herself she was investing in his future, helping him learn from his mistakes. But standing here now, she realized she had been enabling him instead of teaching him. The check in her hand represented more money than David had ever made in a single year. It would solve his immediate problems, pay off his debts, and give him breathing room to figure out his next move. All she had to do was walk up to the front door, knock, and hand it over. He would be grateful, maybe even guilty about how he had treated her. He might even invite her back into the house, but Margaret had learned something important during her weeks at the shelter. She had learned about women who had been trapped in cycles of dependence, who had spent their lives solving other people's problems while neglecting their own needs. She had met mothers who had given everything to their children only to be forgotten when those children no longer needed them. She had seen what happened when love became one-sided, when giving became enabling. Margaret folded the check and put it back in her purse. She had a better idea. Instead of knocking on the door, she walked to her car and drove across town to the real estate office she had visited earlier that week. The agent, Mrs. Patterson, was an energetic woman in her 40s, who specialized in helping seniors find suitable housing. She had shown Margaret several properties, but one had stood out from the rest. "I'd like to make an offer on the condo we looked at yesterday," Margaret said when Mrs. Patterson greeted her. The condo was in a beautiful complex designed for active adults. It had 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a small balcony overlooking a garden courtyard. The community had a fitness center, a library, and organized activities for residents who wanted to stay social. Most importantly, it was a place where Margaret could start fresh, where no one knew her as the woman who had been asked to leave her son's house. "Wonderful choice," Mrs. Patterson said, pulling out the paperwork. "The seller is motivated, so I think we can negotiate a good price. How will you be financing the purchase?" "Cash," Margaret said simply. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too professional to ask questions. In her experience, seniors who paid cash usually had sold a family home or received an inheritance. She had no idea that Margaret had been sleeping in a homeless shelter just days earlier. After signing the purchase agreement, Margaret drove to the shelter to collect her belongings and say goodbye to the women who had become her temporary family. Rosa was in the common area, filling out job applications on one of the donated computers. "Hey, where have you been all day?" Rosa asked, looking up from the screen. "I was starting to worry about you." Margaret sat down next to her friend. Over the past month, Rosa had become like a sister to her. They had shared stories, fears, and dreams during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. Rosa had a strength and resilience that Margaret admired, and she had been looking for work with the same determination that had gotten her through every other challenge in her life. "Rosa, I need to tell you something," Margaret said. "I'm leaving the shelter tomorrow." Rosa's face fell. "Did you find a job?" That's great, but I'm going to miss you. I didn't find a job, Margaret said carefully. I found something else, something I had forgotten about. She pulled out a business card and handed it to Rosa. This is Mrs. Patterson, a real estate agent. I told her about you, about how hard you've been looking for work. She said the property management company that handles her buildings is looking for a maintenance supervisor. It pays well, and it comes with a small apartment. Rosa stared at the card. Are you serious? How did you even meet a real estate agent? Margaret smiled. Let's just say I had some business to take care of. The job is yours if you want it. Mrs. Patterson is expecting your call tomorrow morning. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. How can I ever thank you? You don't need to thank me, Margaret said. Just take the chance and make the most of it. Margaret found Carmen in their shared room, reading to her little daughter. The child was curled up against her mother, listening intently to a story about a princess who saved herself instead of waiting for a prince to rescue her. Carmen, can I talk to you for a minute? Margaret asked. They walked to the common area, while the little girl continued looking at the picture book. Carmen had been at the shelter for 6 weeks, and Margaret knew she was getting discouraged. Her ex-husband had been calling and threatening her, trying to convince her to come back to him. The stress was taking a toll on both Carmen and her. Daughter, I have something for you, Margaret said, pulling an envelope from her purse. Inside was a cashier's check for $5,000 and the business card of a lawyer who specialized in family law. Carmen stared at the check in disbelief. I can't take this. Where did you even get this kind of money? Consider it a loan, Margaret said. Use it for a security deposit on an apartment and to pay the lawyer. He's already agreed to help with your custody case and restraining order. You can pay me back when you're on your feet. Carmen started crying. Why are you doing this for me? You barely know me. Margaret thought about that question. She thought about all the times she had helped David without expecting anything in return, all the money she had given him that he had never paid back, all the sacrifices she had made that he had never acknowledged. Because you remind me of myself when I was your age, Margaret said. I know what it's like to be strong when you don't feel strong, to keep going when everything seems hopeless. And because I can. The next morning, Margaret packed her single suitcase one last time. She had lived out of that suitcase for over a month, and now it seemed strange to think about having a whole condo to fill with her belongings. She would need to buy furniture, dishes, clothes, all the things that made a place feel like home. Linda was working at the front desk when Margaret came to check out. We're going to miss you, she said warmly. You brought something special to this place. A lot of the women looked up to you. They shouldn't, Margaret said. They're all stronger than they know. They just need someone to believe in them. As Margaret drove away from the shelter, she felt a mixture of sadness and excitement. She was leaving behind women who had become friends, but she was also moving toward a future that was entirely her own creation. Her phone rang as she pulled into the parking lot of her new condo complex. It was David. Mom, where are you? His voice sounded panicked. I went to the shelter to see you, and they said you had moved out. Are you okay? Margaret looked up at her new building, at the windows of the condo that would be her home. She could hear the desperation in David's voice, the same tone he had used every other time he needed her help. I'm fine, David, she said calmly. Better than fine, actually. But where are you staying? Do you need money? I feel terrible about how we handled things. Jessica and I have been talking, and maybe we were too hasty. Double quote. Margaret smiled. David's crisis had probably gotten worse, and now he was realizing that having his mother around might be useful after all. But that version of their relationship was over now. David, I want you to know that I love you, she said. I always will. But I'm starting a new chapter in my life now, and I'm excited to see what comes next. What do you mean, Mom? You're scaring me. Where are you? Margaret looked at the key to her new home in her hand. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, she said. Take care of yourself, David. Learn to solve your own problems. You're stronger than you think. She ended the call and turned off her phone. Tomorrow, she would call David back and they would start building a new relationship, one based on mutual respect instead of dependence. She would tell him about her fortune eventually, but only when he had learned to value her for who she was, not what she could do for him.